Welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be continuing our conversation about Toulmin and the rhetorical method that is associated with his name. So this is part two. In the first part, we basically gave ourselves a sort of introduction to the overarching context of what Toulmin was grappling with and what a number of our theorists and methods are going to be grappling with in the coming weeks. And that was basically this is-ought problem, this problem where we have all this data, but we discover that the data gives us no access to a discussion about what we ought to do or should do. There doesn't seem to be a purely logical connection. And so we have this infinite chasm. That infinite chasm is there, as we discovered, because, well, when we get a set of data in front of us, there are practically an infinite number of things that we could do with that data. So we could do zillions of things, but out of those things that we could do, we seem to be able to decide what we ought to do with a pretty good, outcomes for the most part. I mean, of the million things you can do, most people tend to decide very quickly on a rather narrow set of things that they ought to do and figure out how to go about those. So what is happening there? How is it that we are bridging this gap between is and ought? And as we looked in our last lesson, we discovered, of course, well, there's only one way to do that. The support that holds up that bridge between the data that we understand in the world and the things that we decide and conclude we ought to do about that data is we bring something else to the data. We don't just have another data point. Entering one more data point doesn't help at all. We have to come up with something entirely fresh and new. And that fresh and new is criticism. It's a critical judgment. We bring to the moment value judgments, and we decide that there are certain things that are valuable, important, and other things that are less important and less so. And that's how we do it. That's how we make our decisions. Now, that process of introducing value judgments takes us back to the old world of tapping into things that we say, okay, look, I can't absolutely prove to you that this is the thing we ought to do. But man, I can make a pretty good case. And that's where Toulmin steps in. Toulmin steps in and begins to say, oh, okay, once we begin to think outside of the sort of box that, in a kind of a narrow, tight box, that the Enlightenment and modernism had been trying to stuff the human mind and the human experience into, once we're able to open that up and we see sort of a broader scope, then we begin to be able to build connections between these conclusions that we're drawing and just simply the raw data that is out there. So we're going to be turning our attention right now to Toulmin's model itself. And the first thing you've got to know in terms of what Toulmin is doing to help us understand that connection between data we're gathering and things we conclude we ought to do, he's developing a really, really tight taxonomy. Now, what that just means is that it's a heavy vocabulary for Toulmin. So there are a lot of terms that Toulmin is going to introduce, and we need to learn those terms. We need to get our minds around them and pick them up and make sure that we understand them. So what are the terms that he uses? Well, claim is his first term. The claim is basically what you're shooting for. Then he uses the term data. He also sometimes people will refer to that as grounds, the grounds of the argument or the data in the argument. That is those are terms that you can use interchangeably with Toulmin. The data and grounds are basically reasons that you begin to gather from making that crossing, right? That help us understand what's important here. There's also something called a warrant. The warrant is the assumption you make. There's a qualifier that sort of limits us in one way or another. There's something called a rebuttal. It's occasionally referred to as a reservation, and another item that's called backing. Now, all of these are aspects of Toulmin's vocabulary, and he groups them essentially into two basic sets that go together. So we think of Toulmin as asking us to explore the data along with the warrant and the claim, as well as then in another set, the qualifier, the rebuttal, the backing. Those are the sort of things that you're looking at. So what that means is, if you're going to use the Toulmin analysis, if you're going to do a Toulmin analysis, is usually the way we say it. If you're going to do a Toulmin analysis of this text, then you're going to do it in 2 steps. That's usually the way that you're going to most profitably pull this together. You're going to start with your tier 1 analysis, and that's going to be where you're going to explore this idea of the claim, the data, and the warrant. And then you'll move on to the tier 2 analysis, where we explore the qualifiers, the rebuttals, and the backing. So your analysis is going to follow those 2 steps, and that will be how you implement Toulmin's method. Now, obviously, we're going to have to look a little bit more closely. All right. So your first step is in your analysis is to identify those 3 elements in tier 1. So that's where we're going to start our discussion. We're going to open those 3 terms up, and I've given you sort of a sense of them. We're going to define each one a little bit more carefully. And after that, we'll move on to tier 2. But we begin with the tier 1 analysis. We want to examine the claim, the data, and the warrant. And in that exploration, we're not going to forget the qualifier, backing, and rebuttal. They're out there, and we're going to get to them. But we're going to start with the tier 1 vocabulary: claim, data, warrant, and we're going to begin with the claim. Now, for Toulmin, the claim is sort of like the so. It's the thus. It's the thing you ought to do. The ought, right? It's the should that you're trying to get the audience to. It's the thus of the argument. All right. It is at one level the thesis of the argument. Now that's not new vocabulary to you. You know what what a thesis is. The thesis is the point, the purpose, the thing that this particular artifact, this particular text, they mean the same thing, artifact, text, the thing that this particular text, this particular artifact is edging you toward, wanting you to embrace. Okay, it is the controlling idea of this message. Now, a claim, Toulmin wants to point out, may be directly stated. Today, I'm trying to convince you that we are going to need to raise taxes on pet owners. Okay, all right, so there's a place to start. Or a claim can be implied. It doesn't have to be stated directly. And indeed, if you're looking at an artifact that is, say, a statue, or you're examining the architectural layout of, say, a religious site, you're going in and looking at the way a certain religious building has been built to create convictions, well, then there's not going to be a clear, direct statement there. Nobody's going to come out and say, well, here's why you have these 4 arches instead of 7 or 9. Okay, you've only got 4 arches because. Nobody's going to explain that to you. It's going to be implied. Okay, so depending on the artifact you're looking at, you may just absolutely have an implied claim, or you may have a very clearly stated claim. But the claim is the thesis. It is, in the end, the term that's, I think, captures it better than anything else. It is the controlling idea of your artifact. It's what your artifact wants from the audience. You find the claim essentially by asking the question, okay, so what's this rhetor trying to prove? What's the rhetor up to? What does the rhetor want from me? What does this rhetor want me to think or to believe or to do? All right, that's the claim. If you can answer that question, you've got your claim. That's the first thing that you have to focus on. Now, I want to be clear, we've talked about the is-ought problem. The is-ought problem is a large ethical problem. It's a moral dilemma that we find ourselves in because we gave up thinking a certain way. But it's really important to understand that when we talk about the claim as a so, as a should, as an ought to, as the controlling idea, not every claim is moral, right? Not every claim is like that. There are all kinds of claims. You can have a claim of fact, for example. You may be trying to convince somebody that something is true. I'm trying to convince you that Jerry should be fired from this job because he's a bad worker. Okay, I'm trying to convince you that Romeo killed Juliet. Okay, that's a claim that basically is rooted in fact. But of course, you can also have moral claims. You can have any kind of value judgment claim at all. This is immoral. This is wrong. I want you to believe that if you do this, it's a moral failing on your part. But judgments can also be, you know, I want you to believe this was a great movie, or I want you to believe that that's a lousy restaurant. You know, that's a perfectly legitimate claim as well. Claims can be about policy, about actions. Here's what I'm saying we ought to do, an action that we ought to take. Claims can be about definitions, categories. Is this or is this not in the category of dangerous? Okay. Okay, so these are all, so you can have claims all across a very broad scope. Don't limit them to any one idea. Look for what your artifact wants from you. That's the claim. That's the controlling idea of this particular artifact, this particular message. So that's the claim. And your job as a critic, using the Toulmin method, your first task would be to go in, isolate the tier 1 terms. First of the tier 1 terms, claim. Look at your artifact, answer the question, what does this artifact want from me? That's how you get to your claim. All right, if that's the claim, let's go on to the second of the 3 terms in the tier 1, the first step of using the Toulmin model. We're going to look at data. Data or grounds. Data or grounds. The data is essentially the statements or the ideas that are going to prop up your claim. Okay, the supports that make the claim seem like a good idea. Now, it's sort of like it's a very close kin to another idea that you have already worked with called the main points. Okay, so if you're looking at a standard sort of you know, typical rhetorical artifact in the form of an argument in words, then basically the claim is the thesis. The data is sort of like the main points. Not just the main points, but certainly the main points might help you begin to understand what we're talking about here. Data is anything that's going to support, that's going to make the claim seem like a really good idea. Okay, that's the job of data. So data is up there propping up the claim, supporting it, giving it a sense of value, that it's giving it a sense of importance and being reasonable. All right. How do you find the data? Well, okay, you find the data basically by asking, what is it that this rhetor is saying or doing to get me to the claim? That's how you find it. You find the supports by asking, what's the author offering me as a good reason that I should go out and embrace his claim, her claim, the claim? Why? Why should I do it? That's where you're going to get the data. Okay, data is going to answer that question. Now, data, as I say, you can think of it sort of like your main points, but in Toulmin, we're going to pick that data up in our analysis, and we want to begin to test it, to try it out a little bit. We're going to see how tough the data is. All right, there are a series of ways to explore that. First of all, you test the data for what's called reliability, meaning you look at your artifact, you explore and examine the artifact, and you ask, is this accurate? Okay, that's what we mean by reliability. Is the data here accurate? Is it current? Okay, because you can get data that was accurate 6 years ago or 130 years ago, but that's not very helpful to make a point right here, right now, necessarily. So you look at this idea of how reliable the data is, because reliability is a way you're going to make your judgment. So now I'm looking ahead here. All right, I want to be clear. At this point, we're beginning to talk about what you might do when you pass through analysis and you are basically engaged in making judgments. When you're interpreting and evaluating the artifact. How might you do that? Well, one place to go is to check the reliability of your data. Another place to go is to check quality. Now, when we talk about the quality of your data, we're talking about something else. The quality of your data essentially asks questions like, do you have enough data to get me to the claim? Okay, so don't try to build a huge bridge out of twigs, right? I mean, if you're going to make a large claim, we need a large amount of solid data. So we're going to ask the question, have you brought enough data? And is the data relevant? Okay, does it really, really relate to the claim? Does it help get to the claim, or is it doing something else? Is it distracting me from something? Is it clear? That's another quality question about the data. Has the data been presented in a way that we would understand it? A third way that you can begin to think about evaluating the data that's coming up in your artifact, you might ask, is it consistent? Now, when we talk about consistency, we mean, does it sort of resonate with real life? Okay, is this the sort of thing that makes some sense? Is this kind of how the world actually works? That's a place where we can sort of, there's a little bit of leeway. And increasingly in the present day and age, more and more people find the test of consistency breaks down, because some people say, well, yes, of course, it's perfectly reasonable. And it is, in fact, an aspect of real life that we live in a world where, vast alien enterprises are controlling the brains of our leaders. Okay, the idea that is a widespread thought, that you have conspiracy theories that don't end up in the long run with a whole lot of evidence behind them, and yet people begin to embrace them. So this idea of data is really mushy right now in our culture and in our society, and it's a very, very fascinating time to try and critique data. One of the things we want to point out is you don't get to critique the data, its consistency, whether or not it resonates with is it consistent with real life? You don't get to critique that based on ideology, or at least not on ideology alone. You don't get to say, well, I think of the world as being flat. This is data that says the world is round, therefore it doesn't have consistency. Nope, you don't get to do that, right? So the world we're living in is one that is strange, because when you offer critiques, and especially critiques on an issue like consistency, when you offer critiques of data, your own critique then has to be argued for, and your ideology isn't a reason to embrace it. So you got to create a better case than your own personal point of view if you're going to say this data is not consistent with real life. All right, so consistency is there. Is this representative data, or has somebody picked some really strange example and pretended like it's normal? Okay, normal and the usual way that life works. Okay, so that's what we mean by consistency. The final thing that we go to with the issue of critiquing data is appropriate. Is your data appropriate to the audience? Now, when we talk about audience appropriate, what we mean here is this the sort of data, yeah, sure, that your audience would be able to believe? Does it, does it fit the audience that way? But we want to start with an idea that's going to become important to Toulmin as we move a little further into his method. One of the things that we mean when we critique audience appropriation, whether it's appropriate to the audience, not appropriation in any political or ideological sense, but whether it has been rendered appropriate to the audience, is that we have to recognize that audiences, different groups, what Toulmin is going to call different fields of argument, different groups of people are going to accept and be able to deal with evidence in different ways. And they require different kinds of evidence. So if you're going to make a case about a judgment, you're going to make a very different case if you have to make a legal argument than if you have to make an argument about ethics or morals. Those are two very different fields. And as a person who might belong to one or the other of those fields, you would have expectations that there would be a different kind of argument. So your textbook uses a great example. Biologists, if you're a biologist, then your discussion of the human body can tap into things that that most of us wouldn't be able to follow or understand. Okay, so if you have studied biology for 30 years of your life, and you gather together with other biologists, then there's going to be data there that would be very appropriate to you that I wouldn't be able to follow, right? I wouldn't be able to follow an intense physics argument. That's just not data I could make use of, but it might be very appropriate data in a setting where you have a lot of physicists around. So when we think about, is the data appropriate? That's one of the things we're talking about. Don't stand up as a biologist and give a biology lecture to a bunch of people who are physicists. They won't be able to follow you. So we're questioning here, at one level, the sort of expertise of the audience, and we wonder about that as well. Okay, so we've looked at claim, we've looked at data. In tier one, that leaves one final term that we want to examine, and that is the warrant. Now, the warrant is the most powerful aspect of Toulmin's model. This is the pay dirt. This is what you're trying to get to. Okay, you have you have your claim, you have your data. When we get to warrant, this is where we're really getting to powerful insights about how a message is working. So the warrant is your goal. It's the linchpin of the Toulmin model. All right. So what is it? What is the warrant? Well, it doesn't have any corresponding part to anything that we've studied so far. All right. So this is a really new idea. Claim, yeah, it's really, really the thesis. Data, very, very much like the main points and maybe even some of the sub points, just the stuff that builds up the claim that makes it make sense. Warrant, new. We don't really have parallels to this in the other lessons that we've dealt with. So let's talk about what a warrant is and what it accomplishes. The warrant gets you to the sort of hidden levers that are making this really resonate. All right. In essence, the warrant is the set of assumptions, the sort of presuppositions that make this argument reasonable. Okay, now if you're thinking, well, enthymemes, yeah, kinda. A line of reasoning that makes something seem like it hangs together and makes sense. Well, yeah, but that's data. So what's warrant? How do you find a warrant? How do you figure out what a warrant is? Okay, a warrant is the thing that you've got to be sure you believe, or the argument falls apart. It's the thing you have to hold for this to be true. Finding the warrant is really hard. It's the toughest thing you'll do in the Toulmin model. If you're doing a Toulmin analysis, this is where you're going to sweat. This is where you're going to have sleepless nights, banging your head against your artifact. All right. There's no simple, easy way to find it. Here's what we can tell you. You're going to be able to find your warrant when you ask this: what do I have to assume is true before this whole argument makes sense? That's your warrant. Your warrant is what you have to assume for this thing to hold together. Now, you got to be sure that you really, if you identify a warrant, you've got to be sure that you have found something that you really absolutely have to agree to. You have to assume this. You have to feel that it's right, or the argument won't make sense. All right. So it's not, if you've got a warrant that's sort of like, well, I might be, the audience might be thinking this way. And so then it would probably make sense. No, this is a must. This is the thing you must assume is true. All right. That's what you're after. The thing about a warrant is that since it is often tapping into something fundamental in just sort of what we share amongst ourselves as a human community, they're often invisible to us because they're transparent. It's not that they're not there. It's just that they just feel so obvious that nobody gets around to stating them. Like in our example earlier in the previous lesson, we said you just have this guts. No, that should not happen. Okay, well, what's the warrant? The warrant is what you've got to fill in there to justify that gut level feeling. What do you have to assume? What do you have to believe in order to reach a conclusion that says, here's a man on a street corner causing harm to a young child, beating them to the point the child is bleeding, and you have concluded, I have concluded, we've all concluded, you got to stop that guy. What do you have to assume for that conclusion to make sense? Now remember, the data, the facts didn't get you to that conclusion. You inserted something between the data and the ought to, between the is's and the ought to's. You inserted something. What did you insert? You inserted a value judgment. There we go. That's what we want to find. What was the value judgment that you inserted so that the stop him made perfect sense? What was it you assumed? You assumed that there is nothing a child can do that would justify them being beaten to blood. That's what you assumed. That's the warrant. That's the thing that makes the argument powerful. Okay? The argument becomes powerful because of the warrant. Now, warrants are based, as we said, on shared spaces. Okay? What kinds of things might we share? Well, you might find people sharing authorities. You might find that they are essentially sharing a sense that, the Constitution of the United States of America is the final word in law. There you are. That's what the Constitution says. Who gets to interpret the Constitution? The Supreme Court. Well, okay, there was the Supreme Court ruling, so this is legally, this question is now over. Okay, now you might have other questions. You might raise questions about morals. You might raise questions about, pragmatics or whatever. But if the Supreme Court rules on something, that is over. That concludes it legally, right? Until the Supreme Court gets some other case and says, okay, well, now we've got to think about it from another way. The point is, we share a certain authority as citizens of the United States of America. That authority is the Constitution of the United States, and the voices that get to determine the legal meaning of the Constitution of the United States of America are the Supreme Court justices. Those men and women are our shared authorities. Okay, so we can assume certain things based on our shared authorities. Now we have other shared authorities as well. If you're part of a religious group, you will have shared authorities within your religious community, right? Priests or imams or rabbis or holy men who will be teachers, prophets, and those people those people are authorities for your community. Now remember, Toulmin is thinking about groups having different argumentative fields. Well, part of what he means is not only is the data different, but sometimes our shared authorities are different as well. Okay, so know if you're looking at an artifact, you got to know the audience that artifact was headed to. Where was that artifact targeted? Who was supposed to be the recipient of that artifact? Because that group will have certain shared authorities, and that's one of the things you want to tap into to find the warrant that will justify the argument, that will make it powerful. Values. Okay, moving then from small groups like that, values are fairly common. I mean, it's very, there are a lot of different ways to apply values or to understand and interpret things. But in essence, values teach us, the values we are taught. Let's put it that way. The values we're all taught, they don't vary all that crazily. I mean, whether you're in Canada or whether you're in Vietnam or whether you are in northern India, the basic values of life and people getting to make their own decisions and people wanting to be secure. I mean, those are pretty pretty common values. Okay, so you might look to shared values. Maybe you have an artifact that's tapping into one of those absolutely common human hierarchies, values, where we're placing something out there as this is something really important, maybe something that even defines us. Okay, those are values that you can tap into as well. Free speech in America, right? Democracy, equality. Those are all values that Americans share, okay? And that's kind of the definition of America. Now, we're in the middle of having huge debates about what equality means or how democracy is supposed to work. Okay, we'll have those debates. That's great. That's fine. But we all agree that in the end, we don't want to end up, somewhere besides democracy. We can have disagreements, but we still value certain ideas, and we're trying to figure out how to define and work out the definitions of those ideas. But the ability to appeal to freedom, yeah, that's pretty much across the board in the American way of life. So you might have shared authorities, ethos. You might have shared values. You would have shared feelings. Everybody knows what it's like to be happy. Everybody knows what it's like to be disappointed. Everybody knows what it's like to be crazy head over heels in love with somebody who doesn't know your name, right? I mean, we all know that. These are common experiences. Once again, these tap into a sort of almost universal kind of human nature. We all have certain feelings, and you can tap into those feelings. Now, obviously, different cultures will point those feelings in different directions, right? In some cultures, marriage is not supposed to necessarily be associated with love. It's supposed to be associated with something else, security and passing on values and rearing children and that sort of thing. Okay, well, that's a way to do culture. In our culture, marriage tends to be associated with love. But we all know what it's like, even in cultures, the vast majority of cultures where marriages are functional or are even arranged. We have a very dear friend of ours who's in an arranged marriage. They've been married, oh gosh, 30 years now, have 4 kids. They're wonderful. They're happy. They love each other dearly. They didn't know each other when they got married. They literally did not know each other when they got married. They had met twice. But they certainly love each other now. So the idea that love is going to grow because of marriage, or marriage is going to appear because you love each other. Well, okay, those are two different views. Fine. But everybody knows what it's like to love somebody. All right, we all have that kind of experience. Pathos. Look for the spaces where emotions are being tapped into. Is there a specific feeling you've got to have for this argument to make sense? That's the warrant. Now, not every appeal to pathos is the warrant. Don't misunderstand. The warrant is not every single, pathetic appeal you have, but it might be that the warrant is in fact one feeling that that the rhetor has to generate in order to get you to the claim. That's the warrant. Find the one thing, the one feeling, if it's a feeling, that this message could not have happened unless you come to this feeling. That's your warrant. Okay. And then, of course, logos. Well, that's not surprising there. Logos. Reasoning is also a universal quality. You can't add 3 and 7 and get different answers that are correct. Right? That's not an option. Doesn't matter what culture you're in. If you've got 7 and then you get 3 more, you got 10. Okay, and that's true in Egypt, and it's true in Norway, and it's true in Peru, and it's true in everywhere else in the world. It's true in Hong Kong. It's true everywhere. So there's a sense that it may be that there's an element of just reasoning. You have to see that A is true and B is true. And if A is true and B is true, then C has to be true. Okay, so if I'm going to argue that all cats have whiskers, and I'm going to argue that Methuselah is a cat, I've now created a situation where there's a conclusion you have to go to. Methuselah has whiskers. If all cats have whiskers, and if Methuselah is a cat, Methuselah has whiskers. Okay. That could be a warrant. It could be that you have that kind of a structure to the argument itself. That structural element would be what makes that's the thing you've got to put together. You have to put A and B together in order to get to the conclusion. Look for the have-tos. Now, like I say, especially when you begin to look at things like pathos, and you begin to look at values, and you begin to look at shared authorities, often these things are so transparent to us because we have internalized them. We've put them in us. They're directing us. All right. They're sort of inside of us, serving as navigators and directors. And in situations like that, you might very well have a really hard time finding it because it's so obvious that you overlook it 133 times before you get there. That's what you're going to have to grapple with in tier 1. All right. So that is sort of the tier 1 analysis. All right. You got to find the claim. What is it that this message wants from you? You got to find the data. What are the reasons given for doing it? But then somewhere in there are fundamental aspects of the argument that somebody has got to embrace. They have to say yes to. Those are your warrant. That's your warrant. And you've got to sift the warrant out. All right. That's tier 1. Now, if that's the sort of large structure, we're going to look at some of the fine print of the message next. Okay. The claim, the data, the warrant, those are big issues. They're the ones that we want to focus on. And that, like I say, that's the real first step that you're going to take. So your analysis, if you do a Toulmin analysis, that's your first step. You're going to identify these elements. Once that's done, you're going to go on then to that second tier of analysis. You're going to do a step 2, and that step 2 is going to pick up the idea of the qualifier, the rebuttal, and the backing. That is the vocabulary we want to look at next. So let's turn our attention next to tier 2 analysis. Let's take a look at the qualifier, the rebuttal, and the backing. Okay.